started. Hello again to those who are here, and hello to those who are listening to the recording. And today we are meeting for an open session so that um, I can share some information about the traditions of birth, wedding, and death in Lithuanian tradition. But before that, as there are quite a lot of new people here, I thought it could be wise to say a few sentences about myself. I promise it won't be long. It's better to talk about uh, things that are important, But there's the saying that you can only trust a person if you know something about them. You cannot just trust someone that they're saying the truth. So my name is Evelina Victoria Žemaitytė. I live in Lithuania, and I have started offering lectures on the topic of Lithuanian genealogy a few years ago to local people here. But then after a while, I saw that there are quite some challenges in the research when you have your roots in Lithuania, but you live somewhere else. And then there is the language barrier, and it's difficult to know, just to know, where to look for information. There's no manual or something. So sometimes it can get tricky. And actually, it's been a year now since I have been giving these lectures and inviting to meetings in English. And I think we have done quite a lot of good work with people who join the sessions, and I'm happy that and there are people here with whom we work together, and I think that the results are quite all right. So I'm happy. So yes, that's my work. My work consists of educational programs, private and open lectures, private consulting, etc., on the topics of Lithuanian genealogy, Lithuanian heritage, local history, and traditions. Although I am not an ethnologist or mythologist, my main area of work is genealogy, and then we look at those things from the aspect of genealogy. And also, I'm doing my master's in the field of Baltic languages and cultures. So that's that. And now let's continue talking about our topic, which is traditions of birth, wedding, and death in Lithuania, or in other words, the circle of life. And some of you probably already know this chart by heart, or at least you recognize it from my other lectures. But this chart was put together to illustrate the circle of the year, actually. So why am I showing it to you right now? Well, because the circle of the year and the circle of life, they are kind of connected. And we can draw these parallels between the cycle, of the year, how everything changes, and the cycle of human life. And not only human life, just life. So if we look at the main points, then at the very top, we have the highest point of summer. We have the month of June when everything is lush. That's when we celebrate St. John's, the shortest night of the year. On the right side, we have the calm period. We have autumn, the beginning of November, where we cannot say celebrate, maybe commemorate All Souls Day. Although in the previous times it was a celebration, now it changed. Then at the very bottom, or the highest point on the other side, is Christmas. And Kalėdos is the old word that we kept, actually. It's interesting because Christmas is a Christian name, but Kalėdos comes from the Baltic tradition. And then on the left side, if we go up, we have Shrove Tuesday, and everything starts getting more and more alive again. So it's kind of the circle of things growing and dying down, and then staying in this um, state of under, and then starting to grow again and again and again. And it's similar with how things happen in our life, right? And in the mindset of our ancestors. For the new to be born, something old needs to leave. And it's interesting because if we think about it, well, the traditional thinking, just, if we don't pay attention to our ethnicity or etc., is that, well, when we are born, it's new, then we have the celebration of marriage if we decide to create a family, and only death is real death, and we are kind of scared of it in modern times. But actually, rituals for each event in person's life used to symbolize beginning and end. They always come together. So we'll try to look at each vital event in person's life, and we'll try to see how that is reflected. But also, as I said, we will look at everything through genealogical perspective. And I must say, it's impossible to just explain everything and say that this is how it definitely happened in every ethnographic region in Lithuania. It wouldn't be true. If someone says that, it's not correct. Sometimes people share these kind of slides online on social media where they say, well, this is the tradition and that's it. Well, we have those main traditions that we try to keep now, but actually, if you look historically, in each little place, some traditions were different um, than, in the neighboring town. So, you know, it's just very important to understand that there are a lot of things we cannot even know because we don't have sources. Especially if we go way back, the further back we go, the less we know. So it's not accurate to draw these very specific conclusions very often. And if we would be talking about traditional festivals, it would be even more true. When we speak about vital events, it's still similar and it's reflected in the traditions that we forgot the old meanings for a lot of them, and things that we considered rituals later stayed traditions, and now we only have, well, we don't have statistics, right? But only 1 or 2% of what used to be there, and we don't know for sure. And if we talk about this meeting of Baltic tradition and then the Christian tradition, then we need to see that they affected each other, of course, but also we would need to say that Christian tradition um, came over, and we don't have trustworthy sources that would say that this was the system of Baltic religion, for example, or Baltic festivals. The first written sources that we have were written by the enemies. And the words, the names, for example, of gods, the descriptions of rituals on specific festivals or events, they might have been misinterpreted, and there is not a lot of even those. So I thought, well, it's worth mentioning that. Knowing that, I'll try to paint this um, whole view of how it could have been like, but only in later times. So we cannot know for sure how it used to be before Christianity, for example, before it entered, our area, and most of the traditions that survived are a result of this merge, you know, old traditions and new traditions mixed. Okay, let's start with birth. So it might be difficult to think about birth as an end, but if we think about it, it of course is the beginning of new life, but it's also an end in parents' life, mostly, because the old stage of life ends, and now this is going to be new. And if you think, well, we are focusing now on the Christian tradition. If we would talk about other religious communities, it would be a different topic, a different talk, and we would need more time for that. So we are focusing on Christian tradition that took over the old Baltic belief system. And when a couple would get married, of course, it was already an end of this previous period. But then again, when they had their first child, it was an end of this of the rules of life together, and now something changed, and they needed to learn to live again. So, in the sense of looking at from this point, it was an end of something, and then the beginning of something new. And from what's known, and why it's known is because although Christianity came to this area, people still tried to keep the old traditions, the old ways, you know? And although they started to force people to go to church, to have baptisms in church, etc., people still continued to do their old rituals. So for quite a while, there was this period when it was a time of fighting, I guess. And from that time, after, the country was already considered baptized, from 14th century, for some Magisha from the beginning of 15th century. For quite a while, for 2, 3 centuries, um, people still kept doing what they were doing. And it wasn't so accurate as it would have been before, but still there are some descriptions from that period. And we know that people would do rituals and prayers, and they would make offerings to gods for the daughter to be fertile. So if we are even starting from the birth of the daughter, and especially women from of that family, the mother, they would pray so that this daughter will be fertile when she needs to have babies. And well, I say needs to have babies because it was a way of life. And another thing that they would pray for would be for that the firstborn is a boy. It was considered better luck and just better for the firstborn to be a boy. Why? Well, of course, so that this boy can inherit the household, to be the head of the family, uh, going into the steps of the father. And yeah, now if we talk about children as a separate topic, of course, um, although they wanted to have the first son, daughters were also appreciated. And if you listen to songs, you'll hear that basically a son is someone who can take over the role of the father. Well, in the sense that he can manage the household and take care of younger children if something happens to the father, but also the daughter is someone who helps the mother, in the household, if we are thinking about the roles of the old worldview. But if there were situations when the child was unwanted, for example, there are already 10 children in the family and they don't know what they are going to eat, or the unwanted child is out of wedlock, then, um, of course, there were ways how people tried to avoid such pregnancy. And women would take some herbs. There are even these descriptions of concoctions made out of chemical parts together um, with herbs. Uh, and rue plant. Rue plant is considered very Lithuanian, right? Although it's not, its origin is not Lithuanian. It was brought to Lithuania together with monks, the Christianity. But actually, this plant was used also for, well, homemade abortions. And sometimes women would even eat gunpowder so that they could get rid of the pregnancy. But if other people learn about someone trying to uh, either get rid of the pregnancy or trying to avoid getting pregnant, it was considered dishonor. So, especially when Christianity came, I cannot say for sure how it was before, but when Christianity came, the belief was this, that if the woman gets pregnant, it's a blessing from God. And there's the saying, if God gave you teeth, God will give you bread. And, well, meaning that if you have the child, God will take care that you have something to feed. And it was a really bad thing from, this point, how others look at people who tried to avoid having the child. Now, it was of course a joyous occasion, and there were families who really put a lot of effort so that the daughter would be fertile, and it was always the talk was always about the woman because it was believed that mostly everything depends from the woman. If she's fertile, then all is good. Although there are descriptions of recipes that men would be fed some concoctions, they would need to drink something so that they are also healthy and the child it is possible to conceive a child. But when the woman was already pregnant, everyone started talking. They would guess the future of the baby. And they would look at the shape of the belly, or they would, look at even at nature, how it was at that time, and they would try and guess uh, what the baby will do when when they are an adult, or what will be the baby's character, etc., etc. And there were a lot of superstition. And those superstitions, I must say, they are still alive because, for example, it was believed that a pregnant woman uh, cannot feel fear, or get scared of something, like something sudden happens. That there shouldn't be such feelings for a pregnant woman because she might lose the baby. There were all these different other things in each region. They were different, you know. And sometimes it feels that although it was unhealthy to get scared, all these superstitions, they are like, what can I do? Where can I look? For example, it was considered dangerous for a pregnant woman to look at a house fire. There's a fire somewhere in the neighborhood. She cannot look. If she looks, then she needs to do some rituals to kind of cleanse from that so that everything is good. Also, for example, it was considered that no one should invite a pregnant woman to be a godmother to another baby because this woman might lose her baby. So there were all these things that people believed in, and then there were cures, the new strange rituals that needed to be done in case something like this happens. Also, there were spells to protect the baby, and that comes from um, the old faith. Let's say it's always difficult to see religion because we don't have the full system. We just have some snippets of how it could happen, like. And I feel it was more the system of beliefs and worldview than just a religion. So there were spells to protect the baby. A very important person in the process of birth and preparing for birth was a midwife. There were these specific birth rites, and before the baby is born, preparing for the birth, during the birth, and after the birth. So there are also these superstitions connected to the moment when the birth starts. So in Aukštaitija region, there used to be the saying that all the doors and chest lids need to be open in the house so that the baby, the birth is easy and the baby gets born easily. And actually, I have heard about this. One of my old colleagues in my old job, she was in birth, and our boss texted us that wherever you are, open your drawers, or if you're in the car, open your compartment boxes, etc., etc., anything, so that it's easier for her. There are even descriptions of cases when the birth process was difficult and the father of the baby would need to tear his shirt apart as a symbol that something is freed up, that something needs to be loosened, so that the birth gets easier. So all these symbolic actions should lead to the easier actual process. It was traditional to give birth in the sauna, first because it was the cleanest, and second because then they could just be in this separate space, and no one would go in. Other children would be in the house, and they would just have this process of birth there. Also, before Christianity, offerings and prayers were offered to goddess Laima, which later turned to prayers to Virgin Mary for the health of the baby, for the good luck and fortune for the baby. So, well, this applies to mostly everything. If we look at the festivals, many of them that were just changed to Christian ones on the same days, uh, so that it was easier adaptation, to the new faith. And naturally, people started changing the recipient, but the actual meaning was kind of similar. They prayed for help and luck of the baby. And there are also these old sayings, which some of them we still use when the baby was born. no one would say, especially for other children, that the baby was born. They would say, for example, that the old wife caught the baby in the pond, or caught in the river when fetching water, or a stork brought it, which is probably the most popular one and applies to other cultures too. When they were talking about a woman who uh, was in birth, they wouldn't say that she was in birth. They would say that the oven collapsed or the housewife broke down, etc., etc. So all was described in these metaphors. And after the birth, there were also these um, sayings to describe the process, especially when they were talking about placenta. So they would bury the placenta, but they would call it the bedding or the second half of the baby. And they would bury it somewhere around the house or even under some place in the house. And usually they would do that with a thought in mind of what they were wishing for the baby. If they wanted for the son to be close to home, to be the next head of the household, they would bury the placenta either inside the house or um, next to the doorstep. If they wanted the girl to be also have this connection to her home and not to leave too soon, and they would bury the bedding, the placenta, in the flower garden, which was very important for a girl, etc., etc. Now, it was also important after the birth to guess the baby's future. So they would listen to how the baby is crying and look at the features and they would try to guess. If the baby was crying in this, strong voice, they would say that, she'll sing well, or he's going to be a priest. Or if the baby was calm, then again, they would try and guess how they will behave, what will be their character in life. And also, um, in some areas, it was considered important to lay the baby on the floor of the house so that the baby is accepted to this house, to this family, and would have stronger connection and relation to their home. Then they would watch the baby, they would show the baby first to the father, other family members, and only later they would inform the neighbors and show the baby to the extended family. Uh, Fire was considered important in the process of childbirth. It needs to be protected so that there's always fire. Because why the fire needs to be protected? Because it protects the baby for protection. In the process of name giving, they would light a candle too. So fire is something that makes the person healthier. There is also this process, a ritual, women visiting the new mom and the baby a few days after the birth, radinos or abgelei, old words. Basically, they would visit the baby, but it was more for the mother. Would bring some food, etc. In some areas, there were specific types of food, like, for example, making egg dishes. But there was one person, the godmother, who was supposed to cut the first lock of hair for the baby. And it was kind of symbolic. And of course, if we're talking about godparents, we need to talk about baptism. So baptism, it actually goes way back. It's only that maybe baptism is not the right word then, because we don't have another one. So uh, the babies, they would get baptized. Again, we don't know how to call it, before Christianity. There were home baptisms. But home baptisms can have several meanings. First would be before Christianity. After Christianity, there could be home baptisms for very weak babies. So people would have consecrated water or oil, and they would baptize the baby themselves, so they don't miss it in case something happens to the baby. And then they might have an actual baptism in church. But, home baptisms were a thing before that. Then court baptisms followed. And, well, people thought, okay, we don't like that. Let's unbaptize the babies. And they would bring the babies to natural water sources, and they would kind of remove the church baptism. But it was believed that non-baptized babies were unlucky, and if they would die, and it was considered very important to baptize the baby, even if the baby dies, but also that baptism can strengthen the baby. So the old way of thinking was that the soul of a non-baptized baby gets lost, and it only can calm down after the death of both parents. So that was considered that they, uh, finished working for the sin that they didn't baptize the baby. But yes, it was very unfortunate and considered a very bad thing. Also, um, name giving was important. And although in the Christian times, people, of course, would give the names during the baptism, so the priest would give the name that the parents or godparents chose. Before that, uh, people would also have this process of name giving with the old rituals. Now, if we talk about Soviet times, you might know that the activities of church were restricted, and actually, there was this new event invented by the Communist Party, name giving. And actually, I have seen some photos of that process, and it's very interesting, but also crazy how they did that. And it was supposed to show how silly baptisms are, and that this is great. And they would have this procession going throughout the village. They would go around the church to show that this family are good communists and they don't follow the church traditions. They would even have these effigies of stork as a symbol of a childbirth. So they took this, you know, um, folklore symbol and made it something that it wasn't. And it was like a celebration to give the baby a name for good communist families. Well, of course, people would still baptize their babies, the ones that didn't have this all name giving hoopla, although some people might be members of the party, have this one, and then go to another church and baptize the baby. So usually they would leave their location. They would go to, if their parents lived in another parish, they would go to the parents' parish or somewhere else so that they can baptize the baby, and that would go for all other church sacraments. So that was the process. Now let's go back to the older time. There was this very interesting, I cannot even say tradition, custom maybe. Ivedibos means helping someone enter. And that was a process when the woman would enter the church after the childbirth for the first time. So she would need to go together with a priest, and the priest would have a specific set of prayers that he needed to say so that this woman would be able to enter the church again. Now, of course, if we look at the deeper meaning, it probably, we would think it comes from old traditions of spending this time alone and recovering and then re-entering society after the birth. But at that time, Christian times already, the woman should be helped to enter the church. So I know that for some people it sounds astounding, like how is she wasn't dirty or anything, but that was the belief. And if you look at the beginning of church, well, we will see a lot of that. That period blood or childbirth blood was considered dirty, and women especially needed to be cleansed. Well, in this case, the no wouldn't have like a big cleanse, but just prayer. Okay, now what about saint names? After Christianity, um, they started giving the babies saint names, names of the saints. So if we are talking about this unbaptizing, remember? So then they would kind of remove the church name and would give a local Lithuanian name. But in the process of church baptism, they would give the baby saint name. And for the most part, they would keep that name and be called like that. But there were cases, even 18th, 19th century, and sometimes we see that something doesn't go well together because we see that there is this set of this number of babies born in a family, but then when we look at the marriage record, there is another person from this family with the same parent, but the name is different. And then, well, we can only guess sometimes that probably this person was baptized with this name, but was called by another name in real life, and this name was provided in the marriage record. Now, well, of course, there are different cases of that. There are cases when babies have two names and they were called by the second in real life. And we don't call the second names middle names here, we call them second names usually. But it was very, very popular to have these Catholic names, church names. So now we are already focusing on Catholic Church mostly because Lutheran Church again has some specifics that would need to be talked about separately. And there were some exceptions, especially for people of higher rank, noble families. They would be more inventive with names. Sometimes they would be baptized by the planet names, etc., or some more names on the rarer side, not that common, but mostly they were very common church names. Probably the most common few would be Anthony and Thomas, John, Jonas, Mary, Mariana, and Julian. Probably the most common. Also, Jonas, so Joseph, and so on and so on. So there were very common names. And then some other names that were also church names, but not that. Why could names repeat in the same family? So now we are already looking at this if we think about the records. So we look at the records and we see that names are repeating. So if you see several births in the same family with the same name, most commonly it will be that the first baby passed away. And then this name was re-given to another baby because it was considered that now this baby will really be healthy because now he has kind of a guardian. Like the soul of this baby, the first baby kind of becomes a guardian. But usually, if the second baby would die, they wouldn't give this name again. Although I have seen cases where four babies were named the same name and only the last one survived. Also, there could be cases that both children survived. It's just that there was a gap between them. Maybe the first one already left, went to work somewhere, or etc. And then the baby was born. Also, it could be that they chose this church name, so that they have the same guardian, the same saint, but they were called different names in real life. Also, another case would be if one of the parents remarried after the death of another parent, and again there was a gap between children, and they gave the same name. So there are different cases. Now, who were the godparents? Well, usually they were close relatives. They could be brothers or sisters of the parents, or sometimes aunts and uncles. Sometimes more distant relatives who could be neighbors, because that used to happen, or just good neighbors. And just an example of how a record could look like. I'll not comment it in detail. There's a separate class about that, but this is from the times when records were in Latin. So they would write the records in Latin mostly until 1827-28, but it can differ in different parishes. Another example, when the records were written in Russian, and that's important. It's not old Slavonic, it's not old, church Russian, it's nothing like that. It's just Russian, because in we in the Catholic Church um, we don't have records in Ruthenian or Old Slavonic. No, we only have them in Russian with a few additional characters that we don't have in Russian language today, although some of them still exist in other Slavic languages. It's just that sometimes the manner of writing might be misleading. So that's important to know. You can see there is structure, and they list when the baby was born, in what church, name, the parents, where they were born, and the godparents. So, yeah. And now it's time to move on to the wedding. So, again, family life begins, single life ends. Especially it was important for women, because even if you listen to the songs or you can read some translations of the songs, you'll see that the girl kind of it might even feel that she doesn't want to get married. She doesn't want to leave her parents. She doesn't, because her mother is considered good and she wants to stay with her mother and be together. So she kind of grieves her old life before she enters this new life. This not wanting to get married might have something to do with buying and stealing the wife. So in later times, they were only the rights, kind of traditions, customs, like a play where the wife is stolen, but she's getting married. But in the old times, we need to talk about matristic cultures. So, well, some researchers think that it wasn't matriarchy, it was matristic culture here in Europe. And after that, men started to become more important again because they needed to defend the lands, etc. And they didn't want to be dependent on women. So, but that's a theory again. It's a theory, not all researchers buy it, but that's a theory. But there were these, this process of buying or stealing wives. So there was this process when they started, just stealing the wives and taking them. And there are even these tales and again songs where the girl, she's inviting her brothers to come and save her because she was stolen. Also buying, just like cattle. They make a deal with the father. Okay, you're buying your life. But actually, in later times, this tradition evolved into uh, offering money to the family because if she's getting married, then they lose workforce and then they need to be compensated. So, yeah, so that was a bride price. But in later times, it kind of changed because then the family of the bride needed to provide something so that this wife would be attractive to the groom, and that it would be useful for him to get married. Not only she provides her dowry with, with the things that she'll need in her married life. She would weave things and, make things that she will need, clothing, etc. But also, you know, offering dowries in financial sense. But some traditions, they were still alive. And well, nowadays they're alive only for people who try to keep them as a tradition. But in earlier times, of course, it was a real deal and it was serious matchmaking. So in this picture, you can see a magician matchmaker. So it was this whole character, But actually, it was usually a man who would go together with the groom to make this deal, basically. So first part of the process was at close. At close was the process of asking the family if their daughter is ready to get married. Usually they would send a woman, an older woman who would ask this and she would, get the information and then she would share it with the matchmaker. Then the first arrival, they come with a groom. And on the first meeting, it used to be considered important for the groom to act shy, not say anything. And of course, the matchmaker would start boasting the groom. He is good, and they would know that he is fantasizing because there would be these kind of poems, these speeches that the matchmaker would make that were kind of, unrealistic at all. But also, he would say that he was going to be a good husband, etc., etc. And there was this, actually, I cannot even, list every little detail, but they knew how to do each action so that the other party knows what's happening. There were specific actions that, for example, the mother of the bride, the supposed bride could do if uh, the bride thought that, okay, I'm going to marry him, or no, I don't want to marry him. And then there were specific actions that they could do to show. And the matchmaker would know, and they would leave, or they would stay and come again. So it was this, customary law. People knew how to do things in this elegant manner. And as I said, matchmaker would praise the groom, and there was the saying, ate a lot of cheese. So if they would say we ate a lot of cheese during this process of matchmaking, that means that they needed to come for many times. They didn't agree that easily or that quick, and cheese was considered to be the dish of matchmaking process. Although it's not cheese that you're thinking about. It's cottage cheese, probably. That's how I should name it, It was made at home, and this white curd cheese or cottage cheese. And of course, they would agree on who owes who what. They would agree on the dowry, and then it started getting ready. Now, there was this process of matchmaking, then hen party, then wedding. So hen party is not actually a correct way to call it. Now, this is already recreation. This is already modernized version with these costumes, ethnic costumes, but usually this hen party, mergvakaris in Lithuanian, it's just girl evening, if I translate it directly, was supposed to be the process of other women of the community helping the bride to say goodbye to her old life and to grieve the old life and to help her enter this new phase. And lamentation was also a part of it. So they would even have these songs, kind of lamentations, not only for funerals, but for preparing to the wedding. What about bachelor parties? Well, they could have kind of a celebration, like going to a local dance for the last time, or have some drinks. But it wasn't a whole thing. There's no. Well, now people have them in the modern sense, but in earlier times there wasn't this specific custom that they needed to have bachelor party. And the process between engagement, when they already agreed, to the wedding was around 20 days. And in the middle of that, there was this process called nargavimas, and in English, you could say girlhood period, something like that. And in that time, the new bride, she couldn't go alone anywhere. She would need to have a friend or two, and those girls that would go together with her when she leaves the house would even have a specific name they would be called. So they would go everywhere together. Now, of course, it was different before and after Christianity, and even until 16th century, they would still do home marriages with old rituals. Now, after 1536, when the Council of Trent, it was decided that no, we are done with this. They need to get married in church. And that was that. So they started to have those church weddings. Oh, they had some before, of course, but then it was just legal force. There was no other choice. They would be punished if they didn't do that. Although it didn't stop them before, when they would get punished for not baptizing the babies or unbaptizing them. But the most common periods for getting married were October, November, January, and February, because it was not Advent, it was not Lent, and it wasn't the period when they needed to work the field. Mostly these months. And there were different characters, maybe we can even say, in the process of the wedding. There were matchmakers. Matchmakers, why in plural? Because the matchmaker before the wedding, but also there was this woman, Swocha, who would participate in the process of the actual wedding. Groomsmen, bridesmaids, inviters, so someone who would go around and invite the neighbors and the relatives. Dowry carriers, so there would be people who would come with a carriage. They would take the dowry and bring it to the new home. Parental blessing was very important. I was listening to one person who is a part of the new Baltic community. So she said, I couldn't even imagine entering this phase without the parents' blessing. So they would bless the couple, and parents in Lithuanian culture, they took a place of almost holy people. Doesn't matter if their character qualities, how they are, how they behave. It was just very important to respect your parents. Now, in the end of the wedding process, which could be celebrated for the whole week, they would go to the house of the parents of the groom, usually. in the traditional sense. Although there were cases when they would uh, stay and live with the parents of the bride, but that's another topic. And they would be greeted, they would celebrate there for a day or two, and then they would finish the process. Now, the relationship between daughter and mother-in-law, it's depicted in many local, stories, even in writing, in different tales, in songs. And in songs, you would find that the mother is good and the mother-in-law is angry. So it is kind of the plot of how life goes. Although, of course, there were different cases and some of them would just get along fine. But if the parents were not happy about the daughter-in-law, they would, for example, they would allow her to come, because they got married, but they could force her to eat separately, not allow her to come and eat with the family together at the table. So there were different customary laws, and people would adhere to them. Now there is the saying "Gisheo ushkuru," which means that the groom went to live with the in-laws. There is no shorter translation because it's a very specific word. So match your local households, and mostly if the groom would go and live with the wife in her household, it would be a little bit different story. Because if the bride would go and live with the in-laws, then she would need to listen to them and to the husband and to just be a good server mostly. Of course, there were different cases and different people. But if the groom came to live with the bride's family, and that would happen in the families where they would only have daughters, for example, and maybe he was already a second or third son, so he isn't going to inherit. So then the wife would have a lot more say. And in the most cases, they would just divide areas that they are responsible for. And then the wife would be responsible for the home life, and then the husband would be responsible for field work if it's, in the village, etc., etc. But they would be more equals than if they would have been in the groom's household. So that's interesting, I think. And sometimes it was considered quite shameful to go and live in the wife's household. And that was the destiny of second and third sons. Now, this is how a record in Latin would look like. So you can see that I have put some headings here, the names, the status, witnesses, etc. No parents. So if you do genealogical research, you'll reach a point where you'll not find parents' names in the records in Latin. So then you'll need to try and find different types of censuses, revision lists, compare that information and try to reach some deeper information that cannot be seen in these records. Polish record. So this is from 1830s and 40s mostly. And they are quite complex, and the handwriting is usually not the clearest, but it's possible. So just so you know how it looks like. Now I'm showing you these examples not to scare you away from researching. And it's possible, it's definitely possible to learn to recognize names and locations. It just takes quite a lot of time. But, if you're stubborn like me, it doesn't matter, if I'm from here and I know Lithuanian and maybe you don't. There are a lot of local people who don't know neither Russian or Polish. or Latin, and they learn to analyze the records. I don't know Polish, and my Latin is not the best. I know Russian, but still, sometimes it's complicated to read Polish records even after, you know, gathering experience. But your eyes get used to it, and you kind of create your own system. You have your main words and terms, and then it's all right. Now, question. They would announce BAM. So BAMs were these announcements for 3 consecutive, usually Sundays, but not necessarily. If they needed to make the process quicker, it could be every 3 or 4 days. Would they always have these 3 announcements? So no, actually, no, because sometimes the groom could be conscripted to the army, or the bride is already a widow. It's not, it wasn't considered that important. So they would need to get approval from the bishop, but they could have only 1 or 2 bands. Also, if the bride was already pregnant, and well, again, it could go several ways. It could be that the wife got pregnant from the groom or from someone else, and then this man decided to save her from shame. And also sometimes if the the couple were from different religions, so if one of them was not Catholic, again they needed to get approval from the bishop, and some other cases too. So if we see in the record that there are only 1 or 2 days listed, so that would be in Polish and Russian ones. In Latin ones, they didn't list them. Then we might try to think what happened, why. And sometimes you'll see that the first baby was born 2 months after the wedding. So now, who were the witnesses? Again, close relatives, neighbors. Sometimes, and witnesses were only men. But sometimes one of the witnesses could be the father, so it could be a hint, especially in the Latin state. Now, what about maiden names? So maiden names would be, of course, listed in the records, but sometimes they could be mistaken because, they would say, they would ask someone something about the maiden name, and sometimes they would think, oh, maybe they are asking about her mother. And then they would say, oh, this is this name. And then they would just put it in the record. And the same goes for birth records. Sometimes they would say, tell us mother's maiden name, and they would think that not the baby's mother's, but their mother's surname, and then the whole circle of mix-ups. So we need to be careful. We need to compare different records, and usually it's said that we can say for sure that the fact is right if we have at least 2 records that confirm the fact. Okay. Now, where would they get married? So we're talking parishes now. Usually it is said that if they were from different parishes, they would get married in the bride's parish, but not necessarily. Sometimes there were cases, for example, they were from different parishes and then they worked in another parish and they would get married there, or they could get married also in the groom's parish. So although there was this system of customs, there were alterations. And that's it about wedding. And sometimes people ask, could they get divorced? On very rare occasions, if usually the husband did a very serious crime, but only that. But usually it was still death do us part, and only then they could be married. But sometimes it was rather quick, especially if the wife died and there were small children. and the husband would remarry quite quickly. But also for women, it was also common to remarry even in the first 6 months after the death of the first husband. And let's continue talking about that and burial. So usually at this time of year, I do this separate class, but I decided not to do this class. I decided to do the whole thing this year about the culture of death and burial in Lithuania because I think it's a very rich topic to talk about. And of course, there are people who specialize in this, but I think it's very important to know some of these things when we research our family history. So, first thing that we could mention is that people would always look for signs of that, not that they wanted it, but because it was an important part of life, a natural part of life, but also, well, there were a lot of illnesses, etc. So they would look at nature and they would see how birds behave, how, how the nature is acting. Also, there were even, as to this day, there are some people who do that. There are these traditions, for example, on Christmas Eve, to put straw under the tablecloth. And then people take a straw, a single piece of straw from under the cloth, and the person who has the shortest piece of straw will die first. Well, sounds creepy, right? But that's the tradition. Um, or at least they might get ill or something. And also there were traditions of this type connected to other festivals. But usually people would just look. And for example, in my family, there were actually cases like that. If a bird bumps into your window, it might mean that someone is going to die. And usually nothing happens. But there was a case a year ago in our family when uh, a relative passed away. And when we talked later with other relatives, we were driving with my family at that time and we hit a bird. Uh, it just came out of nowhere to the front window. And at around the time when the person died, we hit that bird. And there were other other events in the extended family, and it might sound silly, why would we think about these things. But that's the thing, that although we don't know these old customs anymore, we don't know the rituals and their meanings, we only sometimes know the kind of external side of those as a tradition. We still have these glimpses to the old worldview, how we see the world. And we are, educated people, we have careers, but we still pay attention to these details. Or, for example, another family member, one of the elders actually passed away. 3 days before that, I live in a village area. There was this huge crow who would come, sit on a very high tree, and how do you say? And the crow cry. It felt like the bird was crying, you know. And for 3 consecutive days, and then the person passes away. So you might think, oh, she's crazy, but I want to illustrate how we think. We pay attention to how the nature acts around it, especially birds. So it's still alive, we can see. This sons, the old sons of the world. But now let's talk about some more uh, accurate or specific things. So if you look at this picture, it was taken by me actually in my dad's old village. Now there are no people there anymore because in the Soviet times they were brought to other places for agriculture. They wanted to do agriculture there. So they just demolished everything, the old villages. But this is a very common view of an old village. You will have a cross next to the road. And if we talk about death, naturally we are talking about the whole process of life and how people saw things. And we reach a conclusion. Let's remember that picture. Now, if we talk about some history, just very quickly, since the times of Baltic tribes, there were different uh, types of burial. And then there is this myth of Sovius, and Sovius was this mythological character in this myth. And then in that document, they describe three types of burial of Lithuanian people: burying the bodies in the ground, cremation, or burying in trees. Well, that sounds intriguing usually. And it is described in many old cultures. There were times when they would put the deceased into a tree and they would wait until there's no flesh left. So, well, of course, natural process of decaying and birds, etc. And only then they would bury the bones. It could be connected to the old cults of Mother Earth, so that they didn't want to pollute the earth with its flesh dissolving, and then they would only bury the bones, the skeletons. But for the most part, it was always either burying the body or cremation. But cremation was not only how we imagine it now, that they would just scatter the ashes or they would have them in an urn. They could have an actual tomb. They would put the jewelry and weapons and tools traditionally, but they would also scatter the ashes inside the tomb. So they would be buried like that. The ashes would be buried like that. Also, similarly to many other ancient traditions, there was the custom of horse sacrifice. So if the owner passed away, the horse, this is usually his horse, but their horse, let's say, would also be sacrificed. Of course, a shift happened after Christianity came, and many of the old customs were changed. I also haven't mentioned that what you see here in this picture is one type of burial in the mounds. And actually, if you read about in the European people coming to Europe, you'll probably read this theory of archaeologist Maria Gimbutas, who was Lithuanian but lived in the States. And she said that she considered that these Indo-European people were members of so-called Kurgan culture, and Kurgans were a specific type of mounds, burial mounds. So it's just interesting. But of course, they would also have, in different periods, they would have different types of tombs, and there were mounds, but there were also just typical tombs. So after Christianity, cremation was forbidden. They needed to bury the bodies without any earthly riches. And why would they do that before? Because they believed that the soul will need all those things in afterlife. So that was forbidden. Well, because it didn't make sense. They wanted, to keep those riches in this world. And they started using crosses, of course. Now we have cremation process in modern times, but still some priests are against it. Also, some priests say it's okay, but you need to bury the ashes. You cannot just scatter them somewhere. You need to put them into the forever resting place. So that. So can we say it was a collision or a merger between the cultures? Both probably, because there were times when they collided. But also, everything kind of merged. Now, I thought it would be interesting to also show you some symbols of the sacred culture of the Lithuanian village. And we'll focus mostly on 19th, 20th, 21st century. So if you go through an old village now, you will quite often see something like this. It's called a little chapel, koplytėlė, and it's quite common. Still, to this day, not a lot of people build them anymore, although some do. But we saw this cross next to the road, and they would build crosses in the old places of these villages that were demolished, etc. And not that people go to these old little chapels often and pray. Maybe some of them do. It's not just the common practice, but they are still respected for the most part. Of course, there are thieves and all these, things happening, but for the most part, it's respected. And now, if we think about death, and if we think about the whole sacred culture, they're very connected because people would do everything even before Christianity, but also after Christianity, to not make God mad so that they go to heaven in Christianity already. And then they would pray and they would do everything so that they have good life after death. So everything is super connected, and sometimes I think we could say that maybe they are not exactly the same, but they are very much related to each other. And I just want to show you some examples of how these symbols look like now. And this says, Mary, protect us. So, kind of form of prayer to have this. So, and some older pictures from 20th century. Another one. So, traditionally they would build these small chapels in commemoration of Saint Mary, Saint Casimir, Saint Joseph, Saint Jacob too. Also Saint Anthony, very important saint. This is in a cemetery, so this could be in a cemetery too. Also, some of them could be in the trees, and there are also these chapel posts that people would build too, and they are similar, just they are on a pole specifically. They are high in the sky to kind of show respect. Also, people would build crosses in homestead. So you build your house, you build a cross. And for example, my dad told me that his father would always say that there used to be a cross in that homestead. It wasn't there anymore. And he already had wood because he wanted to rebuild it. He passed away and he couldn't do it, but he wanted to. And yeah, now again, some examples, and they're quite big, you can see, next to houses. And in later times, people would still build these crosses in the old locations of the villages, that in commemoration that they lived there, so that it's clear that there were people there. Another example. Now, crosses are actually important part of the culture, and I know that for some people from other places, they might seem scary, especially the Hill of Crosses. And I think that I have seen the Hill of Crosses mentioned in one of one of the list of the 10 scariest places in the world. And I don't know how crosses are the same way of scary as the island of dolls, creepy dolls. I don't know. For me, for me, it feels different because I grew up here. But the Hill of Crosses is basically the symbol of faith and resistance. People started in St. Clair when started bringing crosses on this mound, and especially in Soviet time, there were many attempts to demolish it. To they even made these they tried to drown the surrounding area so that people couldn't reach this mound. Still, people managed to. There were even events when there were fires there. Maybe some of them were intentional, maybe some of them were just an accident because even after the Soviet times, because, well, there's a lot of dry wood in the summer. And some of those crosses would be built there on purpose. Some of those crosses would be taken from cemeteries because in the beginning they built a cross. When they bury a person, only then they build a tombstone. Some of those crosses are really, really small, and you can even buy uh, a small cross there. There are sellers now, and you can write your wish or you're praying for help for you or for a family member, etc., etc. And people leave their rosaries there, many things. So it's like center of faith. Now there is also a chapel built there next near the location of this mount. And it became a symbol of resistance because people were going against Soviet government. Also, there are I think 60 around the number is around 60 of Lords of Saint Mary. So the French one, but then people built these places of worshiping Saint Mary all around the country. And usually they consist of some stones, and they look something like this. People come together there. Sometimes there are masses held there, and you can just pray. This is the one that's local to my area. It's a little bit different. It's in this place where people were killed during war. So it's kind of a memorial site, but also they started building those little chapels, and it's considered the Lord of Saint Mary. Also, an important part of Lithuanian folk art and um, church culture and traditional culture are these wooden sculptures of Jesus Christ in the position of um, it's called the warrior, rūpintojėlis, someone who worries about the world. And these sculptures are made by these folk masters. They're called dievdirbys, and they can make either sculptures of saints or sculptures of God. So it's kind of a type of folk art. And all these symbols, they still survive. They are not gone. You have seen the pictures in color. They're taken by me just in the past few years. So people still respect those things. And you might not even be a practicing Christian. I don't consider myself a practicing Christian, to be honest. But I still respect that as a symbol of tradition. And now it's important to say that now people are fighting a lot about how Christians took over the old belief system, the Baltic traditions, etc. And they're trying to recover those Baltic traditions, although it's probably impossible to do that authentically, but it's good that people are trying, of course. But I always say, whatever you choose, if you choose church or if you choose the Baltic way, it's not right to keep this anger because we cannot change the past. And they always try to emphasize that we cannot change the past. It already happened. It doesn't, depend from us. We can just accept that it happened and learn from it, and then try and, if it's possible, recover some history, some heritage. But for the most part, we have this result of this intertwined culture, and it's sometimes impossible to distinguish which comes from what, which comes from church, which comes from the old tradition. Because in every place in the world, church is different because it was based and adapted to the old ways that people can, adapt easier to the new faith. So, yeah. Now we need to talk about the funeral. Again, we'll be focusing now on mostly on the 20th century, 19th, 20th century. So let's imagine a Lithuanian village and someone dies. So neighbors would be informed. They would help free of charge. It was considered improper to refuse to help. So if your neighbor asks you to slaughter a pig for a funeral dinner, you do it. If they ask you to come and help in the house to prepare everything, you come and do it. So the room where they would hold the vigil, because it was done at home, would be prepared. Mirrors in the whole house would be covered. They would cover the walls, at least in the area where my ancestors lived. They would cover the walls of the room with these specific type of blankets. So they are traditional viewing, but you can see that the colors are kind of black and whitish, darker colors. Because these blankets, they would come in all colors and they would be used in daily life, but there was a specific type of those blankets used for funerals. Vigil would be held for 2 to 3 days, even. Usually it was 3 days, 2 nights. People would stay awake and sing and stay with the disease throughout the night. So they would sing prayers and specific hymns. In Samodisha, to this day, it is customary to sing the specific set of hymns called Žemaičių Kalvarijos Kalnai, Žemaičių Kalvarija Hills. Žemaičių Kalvarija is one of the locations where church celebrations happen every year and people come together, loads of people come, and there is a specific set of hymns. And now there is the traditional way of singing it and the new way of singing them, shortened version. But the traditional ones, they would last for 3 to 4 hours. They were long, and they would be sung in the evening. In other areas, they would sing rosary. And also other songs that would be, mm, that could be applied to the process of the vigil. And again, usually it would happen at home especially until the independence. After that, they started to have these specific funeral homes, of course, and that happened earlier in the towns, but in villages, even in the beginning of the 2000s, they would still have some of the vigils at home. And then they would bring the casket to the church and then to the cemetery. Funeral procession would happen in the earlier times with a horse wagon, later a vehicle. It would be decorated with trees in the spring and summer and autumn with birch trees. Before there were leaves, so in winter and early spring, they would have fir trees. And there would be a path of people going behind, so on foot. Before there were cars, on foot. If it was at home, so they would leave home, they would reach the church, they would bring in the casket, they would have the mass, then they would bring out the casket again, go to the cemetery, and the people would go on foot. What about black clothes? So even until, I don't know, 20th century, sometimes people see these old pictures and they say, why are they not wearing black scarves, or why they're wearing white scarves? So color black wasn't considered the main color of the funeral for quite a long time. And it started happening later. Also, people would just dress in the best clothes they had for funerals, same as for church. And if we talk about dressing the deceased, now it's not like that, but they would at some point they started dressing the deceased in black, except children and young unmarried people, they would be dressed in white. This is a symbol of innocence. Now, what about post-mortem photography? So the actual post-mortem didn't reach Lithuania because it was too expensive. But the form of post-mortem, of uh, taking pictures of the funeral process and of the uh, open casket and everyone standing. So I didn't put such a picture here. I think I have a few of them in the next slide. So if you don't want to see them, I know that some people don't like those. So, maybe you can look away. But I think it's an important thing to know and to understand why that would happen. So the thing is that photography was expensive and they wanted to have some last memories of these people. And just everyone knew you needed to have a photographer. Nowadays, many people don't do that anymore. For example, in my family, we still took some pictures just with our phones. And you'll see the closest family member standing next to the open casket inside the funeral home. And in earlier times, they would take pictures of the whole uh, party, let's say, mm, next to the open casket, next to a church, usually. So this is the procession, you know. This is how they would take those pictures next to church. This is the funeral of my great grandma. Another example, you can see the reeds that they would make, and of course the expressions on the faces, they expressed mourning. This is an interesting one because they have oak leaf wreaths. So although it was typical to have wreaths made of fir branches, now they use all these other types of evergreen plants, and just leaves that stay for a while and then they decompose. So, yeah. Now, one of the most important parts of the funeral is lunch afterwards. So I cannot say it's a wake. Well, we can say it's a wake, but it's a little bit different because traditionally everyone, well, they would do that at home, but now when there are places you can go, everyone sits, and there are cafes where you know that you can order this lunch after funeral. And they are always prepared. They know how to do it. There is a specific list of dishes that they have, and everyone sits around a long table, similarly to how they would do that in weddings, etc. So not just small tables or something. No, everything sits together around a long table. And first, we pray again. So usually there are these singers that lead the prayer, and we remember the deceased, and only then we start eating. And if you would say, oh no, I will not come, I don't want to, disturb you, family members, especially members of the older generation, they might say, um, you will bring, you will take the prayer away. It will be bad for the deceased, if you don't come. So the family members, relatives, neighbors, they need to come. It's kind of the last feast provided by the person who passed away. Now, after the funeral, the traditional way of commemorating is after 9 days. So usually you ask the priest to have a mass. Then after a month or 4 weeks and a year. And in some families, they would have that every year. In some families, after 5 and 10 years also. And then after a while, you can kind of forget, that's kind of family's choice. But these are important: 9 days, a month, and a year. And the 9 days and the month, usually only the closest family members would gather together, but after a year, they could have again a bigger gathering. They would have the mass, and then again they could get together to eat uh, similar lunch and remember the deceased. Now, prayer was and is still considered very important. And they would say, even if the relationship with the deceased wasn't good, you need to pray for them. And they think that this is where our ancestors were wise, because you might think, why would I do something good for this person because we didn't get along? But it's not only for that person, it's for your peace of mind. So you're praying for good afterlife for them, but also I think it was because it was the way of uh, accepting the idea that they are gone and accepting that this relationship wasn't perfect, but kind of releasing it and forgiving too and asking for forgiveness. So that was important. Now, death records, I chose a Lithuanian example here. They would include the date, of course, the area, the name, the cause of death, then the family information. So in this case, it says that this person's wife passed away before him. How old was he? And the children that they had were still alive. And then where this person was buried. Now we talk about the cemetery. I'll show you some pictures so that you can, if you haven't visited Lithuanian cemetery, so you can have kind of an idea of how it looks like. So the traditional cemetery, if you see such a wall around it, it's kind of a fence, a stone fence, it will be an old cemetery. That was traditional. It was important to have this clear border of the cemetery. In the old cemeteries, you'll also see that there are church-like buildings. They are chapels, actually, in the middle originally, but now they might not look like they're in the middle. And the oldest crosses will be the metal ones. So you will see different types of metal crosses. They are even considered a part of the protected heritage sites. There are projects where they recover them, even if there's family that takes care of the grave. There are projects where that come from I'll not say government. For example, there was this project in our area where people from one of the schools of higher education were doing this project. They received government funding and they were doing this recovery process. So those are the oldest. Also, some of the older ones will be crosses like this. So they might be made of cement or of stone. And then they have these kind of tables with information about who are buried there. And the old crosses, metal ones, they will, if you see such a metal plate, these are really old, and you'll see that even the writing is different from the Lithuanian that we know now. So when people say that Lithuanian didn't change, it changed, especially the writing changed, and it's difficult to read all type of writing. And they didn't have some letters at that time. They used the Polish manner of writing, but they are in Lithuanian. Again, one example. And actually, I still don't know for sure, but it might be one of my ancestors who is buried there. And also, it was common to not only provide the name, the disease, and the year, but also who built the cross. So in this case, it was the son. It says he funded this cross. And then they ask to say Hail Mary 3 times for this person's soul. Or sometimes they want to say, they ask to say this other prayer. I'm not sure what is the equivalent in English, or you pray for the deceased, a specific prayer. Now, some things to know. If you look at the death records, they can only tell the cemetery name, not the exact place of burial. And then there are some old register books that are super hard to reach. Usually they say they don't have them. And it's still unclear how many are there because no one says that they exist. The death records can be found online on EAS, also on Family Search. Also, one thing that you would need to know if you visit a local cemetery is that now there is this new wave of rebuilding the tombstones, and I don't know if it's to save money. Well, maybe it is because each letter costs, it costs to engrave each letter. Families, they just put a surname. In this case, it says family of Raukos. Rauka was my grandmother was Raukaitė, so her father, etc. So in this grave, my great-great-grandparents are buried, but I didn't know before a relative told me, because people who are taking care of this grave,
Hello.
they just decided to put this
Oh, hi.
surname, just surname. And actually, well,
I got
I
I got
understand.
a text on my cell phone. I'm still watching this. The
Someone is
thing that
talking,
we were
and
just
I
watching.
would
It
ask
started
them
at 1 o'clock
to mute themselves because I
about the
cannot
births
find
and
who's
deaths. I've still got that on now. Yeah,
trying, but I don't see
yeah.
who's
I'm
talking.
Paula. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, now I muted them. Sorry. Okay, so they just put the surname, and well, I understand the reasoning behind it, but inconvenient. And they always say, it's difficult to start doing something again when it was already destroyed, and it's easy to destroy something. And I understand that some people are against this tradition of building big gravestones, etc., etc. And maybe we don't need them that big because we have some of the bigger ones. But if we have this tradition of burial with the tombstones, maybe it would be wise to try and keep the historical information, because after a while, no one will know who is buried there. And I wouldn't know if my relative wouldn't have told me. And I will maybe tell my children, but after that, I will need to find a way to mark it somehow, in a book or something, because otherwise, no one will know. And then maybe someone will change it again, and then again, the knowledge will be lost. So, well, it's complicated. One of the main digital systems is Semeti.lp. So you can search there. Also, for some municipalities, there are separate ones. So I will send you the links through which you can access those digital registers of cemeteries. For example, this is for Brno City. Now, if we talk about cemeteries and death, of course, it's also important to remember that we have these days that are dedicated to commemorating the dead, the Elnis and Ilge, so also they, but actually, Ilges is the old name which is connected to the word for longing. We're longing for something. It was the time of remembering ancestors. And it wasn't just these 2 days. So because now we have November 1st and 2nd, and All Saints Day, November 1st started in 7th century, and All Souls Day on 10th century, in the 10th century, sorry. But it is thought that this whole period of remembering the ancestors lasted since the end of the harvest, so around the end of October. In some sources, it says even until Christmas Eve, or at least until the end of November. And it was the period of connecting with the ancestors and with it was connected to thanking them for their help in our daily lives and kind of strengthening this bond, and it's remembering. So leaving food on the graves isn't only the tradition that survives in some Slavic cultures now. Actually, people would bring food on the graves. They would have even these kind of feasts in cemeteries. After that, when they were kind of forbidden to do that, then they started going to forests. After that, they started to bringing the feast, to homes, and then making some offerings to ancestors. And after a while, of course, it all changed. And that feast was supposed to bring the well-being to the dead. This is just a symbolic image of, you know, someone of how someone imagined it could look like. Now, All Souls Day and Christmas Eve, as we know now, they kind of could have been similar. And the original idea behind Christmas Eve dinner wasn't just only to eat 12 dishes, it was to give offerings to ancestral souls. And the tradition of leaving food throughout the night on the table was because it was thought that ancestors will come and feast after us. And it was a little bit different in each ethnographic region. Now, what we have that stayed with us to this day is that it's customary to leave an empty dish and an empty seat at the table for our ancestors. And of course, after Christian times, the traditions of the All Souls Day or the spirit of remembering changed. And well, they dedicated these specific days. There used to be this tradition of lighting bonfires in cemeteries, even, after Christianity. And people would come together in the cemetery, they would pray together, they would sing prayer songs, and then they would just talk about the matters of the local area. They would remember people who passed away. They would even tell stories about them. And there, to this day, there is the only village in Lithuania where people still do that, but they say, when we pass away, because they are already from the old generation, no one will continue, and it will be a dead tradition. But for now, they still do it, and they actually do it for 8 days. Not only for this one day, for 8 days. Now, first candles, what is common now in the cemeteries, started to be lit only in the 19th century. And of course, it was difficult to do that because now we have these glass jars, which are not very eco-friendly. And people are trying to invent new ways, and new material for that, but that's another topic. But people started lighting the candles because it became more of an individual process, not just lighting a common bonfire. Now, why I'm showing you a straw garden is because this time, which we're talking about, was dedicated to remember your ancestors. It was the time when the veil becomes the thinnest, and it was believed that the ancestral souls can reach the house where their relatives live, their family members live, throughout a straw garden because it was the symbol of the universe, the symbol of the world, the symbol of the whole life. And there were a lot of hidden meanings, and people who are masters of this art, they know more about it. But just, uh, to explain it quickly, is that each structure has a meaning, and it was supposed to be the symbol of the world. And just some more examples. Now, of course, nowadays, society is becoming more secular, but as I said, Christian and ethnographic symbols and traditions, they have been intertwined for hundreds of years, and we still have them. Although the modern tendency is to have this fear of death, not wanting to see it, kind of wanting to skip it, not allowing children to go to visit cemeteries, not allowing children to go to funerals, which in my opinion is really bad because children are now um, kind of brought up with this idea that life needs to be easy and there is no this cycle, they don't understand that something will end. And not because they need to see hardship. No, I'm not saying that, but because I think that as people we need to still be a part of this cycle, and because, well, that's the natural way, and we need to see it. And if I hadn't see funerals, and if I hadn't see cemeteries when I was a child, I bet I would see this whole thing differently, although still death scares me. But when I look at younger people than me, and when I look at children, I see that they have no idea how death works and how life works. And it makes me scared, actually, that society is going to this direction. Now, I have talked about Halloween for many times, but I'll just be quick this time. The main clash between Halloween and All Souls Day in Lithuania is because uh, they're just so different and they're so close together. And while All Souls Day is supposed to bring us closer to ancestral souls, Halloween is supposed to scare away something. And although some people celebrate Halloween and they don't see anything wrong in it, people like me, and there are many people like that, are against Halloween actually because of the form that it reached uh, um, Lithuania, and it's just all these how should I say it? And even you have these parks built with scary figures, and everything is just for the most part to scare something away, and we don't know what. All these images of demons, etc. It just doesn't go together with the old Lithuanian belief system, and then they crash. That's kind of the problem with that. And of course, you must see that the circle and the cycle continues. And that's why I think it's important to know and to kind of try and feel it, because without it, mm, it would be difficult to understand life at least a little bit and to accept life. So it's good to know how our ancestors lived and what we have left from their heritage. Now, before we go to your questions, and I saw that you have a lot because I kept checking if the sound is okay, but sometimes people say that something is wrong with the sound. So I saw that there are um, long questions or stories, so I will read all of them. I just wanted to say that next weekend we are having two more classes. On the 25th, we have genealogy in the times of internet. So we are talking about platforms, databases, how to make the research process quicker, what are the possibilities with AI, if there are any, etc., etc. Also finding relatives in the times of data protection laws, some advice. And then on 26th, we are talking about analyzing the records in cyrillic. So a guide for people who don't know the language. Yeah, we'll talk about how they look like, how to identify the right records, etc. And then 9th May, we're talking about some more things that are important in the Lithuanian genealogy research process. Brick walls, unclear locations, unknown burial places, etc., etc. How to communicate with possible or newfound relatives to what to know when you come to Lithuania. And then 17th of May, women in genealogy. So why haven't women in genealogy been studied for a long time? Have you thought about that? And then how do we research female lines and how do we locate the parishes for finding marriage records, etc., etc. So everything related to women. And now it's time for questions. Okay. Let's go back. All four of my grandparents were born and raised in Lithuania and came to USA in the 1910s. I'm interested in meeting with other Lithuanian Americans in my area for sharing conversation. So if someone wants to talk with Yulin, then we have her email. So you could actually post that in our community group on Facebook. We have a group which you could join. So I will send the link in the email with the recording, and then you could post there too. I have used my Heritage Scribe AI to translate birth and marriage records from the 1700s and that are written in Latin and Polonized names. The scribe does a pretty good job except with translating the names. Be really careful, especially with Russian records. If you try, it will not be good. And if you go to our community group, you will scroll down and find my example of how AI does that, because I don't think my heritage has good AI models for cyrillic, for example, especially for the type of writing that was used here. I'm not sure I caught this, but when the baptisms were recorded in Russian and say the 1890s, only the name of the baby where the baptisms were done, or the date of the birth or baptism, and the names of the godparents, or the names of the parents recorded. Yes, of course. So the second column, if you remember, there were three columns. The second column is for the parents. I asked because I found my maternal grandfather's baptismal record, but I want to be sure I have the names of his parents and not the names of his godparents. Godparents' names are on the last column. Okay. I want to visit the Hill of Crosses in Lithuania. So much history. It's an interesting experience, especially if you go for the first time. Definitely, and there are other places to visit in the area. Okay. The Lithuanian World Center in Lemont, Illinois has a beautiful and serene collection of restored wooden crosses, all different sizes, on their small hill in the front of the center. That's good to know, actually. And yeah, we are in touch with the Lithuanian World Center. They are good people. Appreciate the discussion of the photos. I have a handful of these which help me identify other ancestors. Yes, so actually that's what's important, because sometimes there are no other pictures than the one where the whole family is standing. And the one picture that I showed you, I haven't commented, but the picture includes it is the funeral of my great grandfather. It includes the majority of his grandchildren, and my dad has 50 first cousins, so majority of them are in that picture. Can you imagine? And there were no other occasions that they would do that. Sometimes they would take pictures of weddings, but mostly of funeral. I have open casket photos like this from my grandparents' relatives in Lithuania. Mm. Actually, now people don't hide those pictures. They try to destroy them, burn them, etc. And I always say, if you are preparing to burn them, please give them to me, because I'll think of what to do. It doesn't matter if it's my family or no, because we're losing history then. We might not like that. And I have this relative who is very spiritual person, and she said, I don't want that energy. When because she said, could you send me some pictures, because she wants to get to know her ancestors. And I said, I have this picture, but it's from a funeral, but maybe you might want to have it. And she said, yeah, I don't want that energy. And then I just said, I collect these pictures because sometimes it's the only picture of someone. and we don't have any more of them. And then I received another message. Okay, send it to me. So then she was fine with this energy because then she understood that maybe, I will not have another picture. So yeah, we're just scared of that. Of course, it's scary, but when my grandfather father died in CT in 1945, exactly what you described happened. The 3-day wake at home with people from church praying and singing all night, plus the lunch afterwards. Very important. Even my dad, when he passed, he planned ahead for the lunch for everyone. Yes, some people would even save, so that there is enough of everything and the whole thing. It's reassuring to see that a photo of an open casting is normalized. When I mentioned seeing a photo like this when I was younger, non-Lithuanian friends thought it odd. Yes. So non-Lithuanian people think it's just crazy. The same with Philip's process. So, it's different culture. We even took a photo of my mom's open casket in 2008 to mail to her relatives in Lithuania. Yes. What, if any, were superstitions about a stillborn infant or infant that failed to thrive and die the same day? So, as I said, it was considered unlucky to not baptize the babies. That's why sometimes they would immediately baptize the baby at home with the consecrated water or oil. So that's mostly it. What were the thoughts of family if the firstborn child was a girl instead of a boy? Well, it depended on the family. They really wanted to have the first boy, but the first girl, okay, it's fine, but the second needs to be a son. And then the second is a girl, then again, it's unlucky. It depended, of course, on the beliefs of the parents. Maybe someone was just happy to have a child if it was a long time since they conceived.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Okay. Thanks.
thank you, Sharon. Okay, this one we have already answered. That's it. So if we don't have any more questions, we will be finishing because I don't think we will in 2 hours. So I guess you're already tired. I hope that this was useful. Those who are watching the recording, send me your questions by email if you have any. And I will send all of you the recording. I will send you the links to semester platforms, and also I'll send the links to the upcoming classes if you'd like to continue with learning about Lithuanian heritage and culture, and maybe starting or improving your genealogy research process. So thank you for coming here, for registering, and hopefully I'll see you soon. And join our community group, and you can post there and ask questions and share your stories. So, okay, have a nice day, and bye-bye.